Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to NOAA's National Ocean Service Science Seminar Series. My name is Tracy Gill. If you are not on the NOAA Weekly Science Seminar list, but you'd like to be, please email me at tracy.gill@noaa.gov and I will be happy to add you. Folks in the room, please sign in and silence your phone. The presenter today is fine with clarifying questions during the seminar. Please type them into the chat box. And if you are interested in getting a PDF copy or a video of today's presentation, please contact myself, tracy.gill@noaa.gov, or Gyami Shrestha, and we will be happy to send you a copy. And now I will hand it over to Gyami Shrestha, the Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Program Office and the co-host for this seminar. Gyami?
Hello. My name is Gyami Shrestha. I'm the Director of the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program Office. We're an interagency partnership whose mission is to coordinate and facilitate federally funded carbon cycle research and provide leadership to the U.S. Global Change Research Program on carbon cycle science priorities. Today's seminar is the second in a 3-month seminar series titled From Science to Solutions, the State of the Carbon Cycle, the second State of the Carbon Cycle Science Report. This series is a sponsored event by the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Program in partnership with NOAA. Tracy Gill and I are the coordinators for this series. Please contact us if you have questions. Dr. Sarah Cooley will be presenting today. Dr. Cooley Dr. Sarah Cooley, her talk is focused on rising carbon dioxide effects on land and ocean. Here's a background on our speaker. Dr. Cooley is the director of the Ocean Acidification Program at Ocean Conservancy in Washington, D.C. Prior to 2014, she was a researcher and postdoctoral investigator at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, or WHOI, as well as the Ocean Acidification Scientist in the Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry Program Project Office, OCB. Her guiding interests include ocean carbon cycling, science communication, and incorporating accurate ocean science knowledge into policy. In her position at Ocean Conservancy, Sarah works to educate and engage decision makers and stakeholders from every political perspective at regional to international levels on ocean acidification, identifying ways that different groups can take concrete stepwise action on the issue. In her work, Sarah combines science synthesis, strategic communications, political strategy and advocacy, and public advocacy. Dr. Cooley was one of the chapter leads on a chapter of the same title. Actually, it was called Consequences of Rising Atmospheric Carbon Dioxide. This was in the second State of the Carbon Cycle Science Report, and Sarah is going to be talking more about that. Welcome, Sarah, and thanks for presenting your work at the NOAA Science Seminar today.
Sure. Thank you, Gyami, for that introduction. And I'm excited to see the great turnout for today. Thank you all for choosing to spend an hour with me here. Let's see. So yes, as Gyami said, I am the director of the Ocean Acidification Program at Ocean Conservancy. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I was a co-lead author with my colleague David Moore on Chapter 17 of the Second State of the Carbon Cycle Report. The ultimate name of that chapter wound up being the consequences of rising atmospheric CO2 on terrestrial and ocean systems. But I think for this crowd we can use the B word, the biogeochemistry word, because I have the feeling this is a pretty technically savvy audience. So I also want to extend a great big thank you to our other co-authors on this chapter, without whom it would not have come together nearly as easily or as straightforwardly as it did. It's a great group to work with, and we just got in, got that chapter done, and got out, and it was just a pleasure to work with them all. So moving on, I want to tell you a little bit about the charge that we had to write this chapter. Our job was to really assess the non-climatic impacts of rising atmospheric carbon dioxide on land and ocean ecosystems. And that's actually harder than it sounds, because temperature rise is really the first carbon dioxide related change that most researchers think of and most assessments think of. And so we had to kind of peel apart what we could tell about carbon dioxide effects on land and ocean systems independent of temperature. That was actually more challenging than we expected. Also, just a quick note, my contact information is on this slide too. My email is very straightforward. It's SCOOLEY@oceanconservancy.org, or you can follow me on Twitter at CO2LEY. Moving on to what the State of the Carbon Cycle report is. I know this is a series that is dedicated to examining the results of SOCCR2, but not all of you may be familiar exactly with what this report is all about. It's an interagency assessment that is really looking at the state of the carbon cycle across all of North America. It was written by the top carbon cycle experts across groups from the government, national laboratories, universities, private sector, and it went through 6 stages of really, really rigorous review, and that was organized by federal agencies. And then finally, there was also a general public review step, and the final review step was an expert review panel that was convened by the national academies. So review and scrutiny was really baked into this report all the way through. So we can be confident that it is a very comprehensive assessment of the state of the science. It contributes to Volume 2 of the congressionally mandated 4th National Climate Assessment, but it is a focused product. And the product was really coordinated and developed through the U.S. Carbon Cycle Science Plan, which is led by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group under the auspices of the U.S. Global Carbon Research Project, which is what Kiani was representing there. So just a few technical details about the how. And another really important fact to think of is that there were over 200 experts working together to complete this report over, I think, what wound up being a 2+ year process. It was really quite an extended process, partly because of delays, but partly because it is quite an exhaustive process. So talking about the contents of SOCCR2 briefly. The SOCCR2 report in brief is just like a kind of an executive summary top-line document. It's great for skimming. It has the highlights written in plain language for all audiences and the executive summary, which is a bit more technical. But the full report is 878 pages, and it comprises 4 sections that are all interconnected. First, there's a synthesis section. Second is a section looking at the human dimensions of the carbon cycle. Third is the state of the air, land, and water. And the 4th section is the consequences and ways forward. So there's 19 chapters and 7 appendices. The hyperlink for it is on the bottom of the slide. It's carbon2018.globalchange.gov. And it's got a really nice website with really strong search functions. So if you're looking for a particular item, you can kind of zero in on where you want to be pretty quickly. Yes, next slide. We were charged to kind of pick up things from where SOCCR1 left off. Now, SOCCR1, I don't think it's called SOCCR1. I think it's just called SOCCR. But in that document, it came out in 2007. At that time, the state of knowledge was pretty different. So in that first report, the CO2 fertilization effect was defined, and it was stated to be the phenomenon in which plant growth increases and agricultural crop yields increase due to increased rates of photosynthesis of plant species in response to elevated concentrations of CO2. So, in brief, basically, you put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you're increasing photosynthesis rates in plants. Since then, we have had much longer observational records in the ocean, in the atmosphere, and in the land, and we also have had a lot of advances in the understanding of the physiological effects of that carbon fertilization effect. There have been a number of long-term ecosystem experiments and a lot of advances in modeling that are going to be, that really kind of added a lot to our understanding. So one of the observational results that really came clear in the last 10 plus years is that the atmospheric carbon dioxide rise is much less than emissions would suggest. So the global land sink in the 1960s was about 0.2 gigatons of carbon per year to about 3 gigatons of carbon per year in 2014. That results from Corinne Leclerc and her group in 2015. Rising CO2 is very likely an important control on this global land sink. And that's a result that became clearer with the work of Schimmel and Leclerc and Keenan in the last few years. But this plot really kind of sums up, if the total anthropogenic CO2 emissions in the orange line have been what they were, yet we see atmospheric carbon dioxide rising at a lower rate, the carbon is accumulating in the land and ocean sinks. And one project that has really opened up our understanding of this is the Global Carbon Project. Now, they have been using a combination of observations plus model work and updating it annually. And so we have a very detailed view of where the anthropogenic carbon is actually going. So in this plot, above the zero line, the sources for carbon emissions are noted. So the land use change is kind of that mustardy yellow. Fossil carbon is the darker gray. And then below the zero line, the ocean sink, land sink, and atmosphere in blue, green, and light blue are showing where we know that carbon is going. And the very light gray piece is sort of where the mismatch occurs between the carbon released and then the carbon that we know is taken up by those three sinks. But you can see that we really have a much more nuanced understanding than we did just a decade or two ago about where the carbon is going as well as where it's coming from. In another way of looking at it, we can just kind of look at overall sources per year, which is on the left, and overall sinks per year, which is on the right. On the left, this information is actually found in SOCCR2 in Chapter 1, but it's important setup for the stuff that I'll be talking about. And the Global Carbon Project really showed that fossil fuels and industry are really responsible for about 9.4 petagrams of carbon released per year in the last decade, and land use changes responsible for about 1.3 petagrams of carbon per year. Now on the right side of that slide, you can see the mean partitioning of where it's all going. And the growth in atmospheric carbon dioxide is about 4.7 petagrams per year. And the land uptake is about 3 petagrams per year. And ocean uptake is about 2.4 petagrams per year. So now we have to consider what are the consequences of rising carbon dioxide. We'll start with the ocean because I'm an ocean person. But also it's a little bit more of a straightforward story than the land. So I see that, well, I don't know, on my slide it looks like, okay, it looks like there was a word missing, but I think it was just a refresh rate problem. So ocean effects of rising carbon dioxide around the world are causing ocean acidification. So we see that rising carbon dioxide has decreased seawater pH around the world at long-term observing stations that are marked in red in the map in the upper left of the plot. So as I mentioned, this process is called ocean acidification, and it's already affected some marine species, and it's altered fundamental ecosystem processes, and other effects are likely. We have really high confidence in these facts. So these time series data shown on this plot really show the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide since 1986 in the top left with the black trace. And then the increase in upper ocean carbon dioxide concentration since about 1990 in the upper right, the pH in the upper ocean at the same sites, so that's the bottom left plot, And on the bottom right, there's the carbonate ion concentration in the upper ocean. And the yellow, blue, and green colors correspond to the different ocean observing sites. But you can see the progressive change in each of these measures no matter where the data were collected. Yes, next slide, please. Let's see. Okay, suboptimal conditions. Here we go. So what we see is that the current and projected values of ocean pH, ocean carbonate ion concentration are really outside of the historical boundaries. And this means that most marine animals are going to be in new conditions, particularly with respect to pH and the carbonate ion concentration. So on the top plot is the surface pH as projected with models going forward in time using the CMIP5 model scenario, or the model package, model ensemble. Using both the RCP 8.5 scenarios in the black line and then the RCP 2.6, which is the dotted scenarios going into the future. So that gives you an idea that things are really changing in ways that marine animals have not experienced before. And what we're seeing is that follow-on impacts are also likely. So we know, because of sort of geophysical facts, that acidification varies by latitude. We have observed changes in the health of marine species, which I'll talk about in a moment. We have also observed significant coral bleaching, which is technically pushed forward mostly by warming, but it's very hard to separate the effects of acidification, disease, and bleaching and heat, on corals' propensity to bleach. In addition, there is some evidence that harmful algal blooms could become either more toxic or more frequent as a result of acidification. So this is a summary plot that we included in our chapter. It's adapted from a piece in Science by Gattuso et al. A few years ago. And what this plot is really showing that there are sort of two pathways, the low emission scenario on the left and the high emission scenario on the right. You know, on the left, we'd have to work to reach those emissions. On the right, that's sort of the business as usual anticipation. We have a lower projected temperature increase associated with the lower CO2 emissions and about 2 degrees higher in anticipated temperature, and at the same time a pretty significantly different anticipated pH for each of these conditions by 2100. And what's important to note here is that the sort of middle third of this plot shows the species that we think are at prime risk from acidification. There's seagrass and mangroves, warm water corals, pteropods, bivalves, krill, and finfish. And each of those are at sort of different risk because of the combination of factors. So bivalves and corals have been sort of the poster children for acidification, and because they're experiencing harmful impacts right now, as shown by the red in the lower carbon emission scenario, because they're already in difficult conditions, which would only get worse with low continued warming. But on the right, we are seeing that in a higher CO2 emissions scenario, a lot of these species are still at higher risk of impact. And this is because of the combination of warming and temperature rise. And that is going to affect the array of services that these and other species provide to human communities. So in the bottom third of this plot, we talk a little bit about the risk for ocean carbon uptake, coastal protection, coral reef recreation, and fisheries. And all of those are at much greater risk of impact than they are in a low carbon situation if we do not curb our emissions. As you can see, it's complicated. So the key message coming out of this portion of our chapter is really that rising carbon dioxide has indeed decreased seawater pH. Acidification has affected some marine species, and it's altered some fundamental ecosystem processes, and we do expect further effects. Turning to the land, we also examined the terrestrial effects of rising carbon dioxide on plants. And we have a nice box in the chapter which kind of sums up what's on this particular slide. And there's a couple of different areas that the rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is expected to affect plants. One is this physiological adjustment category. So that includes processes like increased photosynthesis per leaf area. That could lead to increased cycling of biomass, nutrient limitation, greater investment in roots, and possibly greater carbon inputs to soil. It also is expected to result in decreased water conductance per leaf area. On the right side of the slide, we point out the plant species responses and the food and crop responses. The plant species responses are really, we expect that C4 and CAM plants are going to have a higher water use efficiency. There's definitely going to be changing competition among species, with potentially weedy species becoming more enhanced than more slow-growing species. And then there may be an upper bound to productivity in forests. There's been some evidence that that will be true. And then regarding food and crop resources, protein per leaf area and crop yield are probably going to decrease. And allergy sufferers start crying because pollen production may increase as well. So when we look at the broader effects of rising carbon dioxide on terrestrial ecosystems, there's a couple of ways we can really look at that. We can look from observations or we can look at experiments. So the observational record shows that there's some amount of greening in the satellite record. We have evidence from tree rings, growth records, and water use efficiency assessments. But one of the challenges here is that the observational record is really, really confounded with other global changes. It's almost impossible to separate the effect of carbon dioxide from, the fertilization effect of the dioxide from the terrestrial warming effect when it comes to studying the observational record. So there's been a lot of experimental advances that have looked at enhancing carbon dioxide in a particular area, and what you see here in these pictures are free air enrichment, carbon dioxide enrichment sites, these FACE sites, where carbon dioxide is pumped into an ecosystem in these big circular emplacements, and the response of the terrestrial community over time is studied. So these experiments have really identified that there are a number of changes in allocation, growth, and competition, and nutrition as well. So that provides some really interesting evidence that of what CO2 can do absent the temperature effect. So in sum, for the examination of the terrestrial effects of rising CO2, it's clear that elevated carbon dioxide affects photosynthesis and growth of plants, the water use efficiency as well, and then the overall hydrology of the area. But it's also very clear that the relative effects differ greatly by species. So that makes it really difficult to start making decade-scale predictions. It is because there are a number of feedbacks, which I'll mention in a moment. So the key message coming out of just the terrestrial evidence for this chapter is basically what I kind of just ran through. Rising atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations are expected to increase plant photosynthesis, growth, and water use efficiency, but the effects are reduced when nutrients or drought or other factors are limiting plant growth. So rising carbon dioxide is likely going to change carbon storage, and it's going to change terrestrial hydrology and biogeochemical cycling. But the effects on vegetation composition and nutrient feedbacks are really hard to predict. So that makes the decadal forecasts uncertain. Here we go. So now we turn to looking at the effects of rising carbon dioxide on the benefits to people that ecosystems provide. We know that there will be difficult to predict changes in the benefits that both land and ocean systems provide to humans. In the United States, there was a very well publicized and studied instance where acidification decreased the supply of Pacific oyster larvae that sustains commercial shellfish production in the northwestern United States. There was a kind of a call to arms. The industry partnered with scientists to study and adapt to this change, and it really kick-started a whole area of effort. And we know in the terrestrial case that crop yields are changing because of fertilization combined with warming. Let's see. Oh, I got a little ahead of myself here. My next slide is actually more on the ocean acidification phenomenon. So with shellfish and crustaceans, a number of studies beyond that initial shellfish example have shown that a number of shellfish, bivalve shellfish and crustacean species grow more slowly and survive less often when trying to attain adulthood. There is some suggestion that there could be some market quality changes, not only time to maturity, but also there's some hints that taste could be altered because of acidification. Fishery impacts are being seen. Predator-prey relationships may be disrupted. As I mentioned before, harmful algal blooms might be also altered because of acidification. Again, that's hard to decouple from warming effects, but really we kind of just have to take the fact that the entire ocean is changing when we think about how do we manage these impacts. Finally, coral reef communities are also showing that they are slower to grow and recover once mechanical breakage or erosion or some other problem affects the growth. Acidification slows their growth and their recovery. And so we are anticipating that's going to change the three-dimensional structure of coral reefs as well as the community composition that's living on the reef. So moving to the terrestrial example, a little bit more on that. As I mentioned before, terrestrial effects are difficult to detect because of the confounding factors. With crops, as you can imagine, there's even more confounding factors because there's a lot of economic factors and human choices and management practices and things that intersect with how the crops are doing. So this body of work is showing that contemporary carbon dioxide enhancement is enhancing productivity, although it's less than expected. And that has to do, again, with the availability of nutrients or availability of water or changes in the water usage of the plants. And so, you know, one of the most sobering ideas here is that some of the crops are likely to have reduced nutritional yield. And my co-lead author, Dave Moore, selected this spinach to Twinkies imaginary shift. It's not that you know, vegetation and vegetable crops will become that non-nutritious, but it's definitely on the whole an effect that is important to consider and think about when we're looking at the effects of carbon fertilization on crops. So the third message coming out of this section of the chapter is really that the consequences of rising atmospheric carbon dioxide are expected to include these difficult to predict changes in the ecosystem services that both terrestrial and ocean systems are providing to humans. And we have a pretty moderate sense of confidence around that. It's possible that there will be fishery changes. Some species will thrive, some species may not, but it's the difficulty in prediction that confounds our current day management of these systems. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of rising carbon dioxide sort of on the side of climate. And you've heard me kind of touch on these already. It's not only in the terrestrial environment are the effects of rising carbon dioxide variable and dependent on other factors. That's also true for the broader effects of acidification. It really acts in combination with other ocean factors like coastal runoff of pollutants, deoxygenation, warming. And on land, we see things like the dominant species, nutrient availability, and drought stress as being really, really strong factors that affect what your outcome could be. And this plot is, or a figure, I guess it is, really shows what we know in terms of how drought stress and nutrient availability interact to give us overall sensitivity. So the darker green in the background really shows this greater relative response to carbon dioxide. And so you can really see that, from sort of bottom right to upper left, there's a real spectrum of responses. So looking ahead, thinking about the effects of rising carbon dioxide on systems in the future, it's definitely uncertain that the land and ocean are going to continue taking up carbon dioxide at the rate that they are. There are a number of mechanisms that would reduce the ability of these sinks to continue taking up so much carbon dioxide. We have very high confidence in those mechanisms. So it's kind of unclear how these feedbacks are going to interact with carbon sinks, and I included these seesaw pictures to give a sense that, on the one hand, we have rising carbon dioxide, which is increasing uptake of land and ocean. At the same time, rising temperature is driving release of carbon dioxide from the ocean. And you can see that those two processes are sort of working counter to each other. And then in the middle, we have things like minerals, microbes, biological processes like photosynthesis and respiration, geological processes, weathering, precipitation, solubility. All of those things are absolutely confounding factors. And we expect that feedbacks, both positive and negative, are going to be really, really key here. So a simple example of a positive feedback in the carbon cycle is just thinking about how more atmospheric carbon dioxide causes more CO2 to dissolve in the ocean. And then a negative feedback to consider would be that warming temperature actually pushes that carbon dioxide out. The bottom line here is that rising carbon dioxide absolutely doesn't act alone. And as much as it was our charge to look at how carbon dioxide is going to affect terrestrial and ocean ecosystems, the effects on these ecosystems are absolutely contingent on global climate change. It's absolutely these processes are absolutely working in concert, and that is our challenge as we think about how we want to interact with these ecosystems. So the key message coming out of this section is that really the ongoing persistence of carbon uptake by the land and ocean is uncertain. And the real difficulty is because of the feedbacks. How the feedbacks are going to modulate the effects of rising carbon dioxide and carbon sinks is where we need to understand more. There are a lot of mechanisms that are likely to reduce the ability of the land and ocean sinks to keep helping us out and taking up this rising carbon dioxide. So with that, I would like to brag a little bit about how great all my co-authors are on this, and thank them all, and thank you all for listening. And I'd be more than happy to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. Lots of information, lots of uncertainty.
It's a difficult assignment that we had to kind of tease out what was certain and what was uncertain. But we're pretty certain that our uncertainty is big.
Are there any questions in the room?
Yes.
Yes, we have a question here in the room.
Hi, Sarah. Bleaching. How are you?
I hear you.
I just have one question. You only mentioned briefly about the respiration process, but I kind of feel like for the terrestrial ecosystem, the mineralization process, like the soil respiration, should be a very factor, and it's highly temperature dependent. I wonder quantitatively how do they compare with each other? I mean, the increased respiration process due to temperature compared with enhanced primary production due to CO2.
That's a really tough question. So I think, so if I caught your question completely, you're asking about the comparison of the increased respiration rate expected from temperature along with the comparison of the increased production of terrestrial plants. Is that what you're asking?
Exactly.
I don't think we know that. I mean, I think we may have some sense of that in specific environments, but I think trying to get a comprehensive sense of how those two things compare is my understanding that the uncertainty bars are so broad because of all the different environments and confounding factors that I don't think, I mean, maybe there's a carbon cycle expert who's been thinking about this in the room or on the phone, and they can say, yeah, you know, we know they're both positive, or we know that they're both negative. But I'm not sure we can even, with a great degree of certainty, predict the sign. I mean, to predict greater than just like it'll probably go up. I don't know if anybody else has some helpful thoughts on that. Oh, I
see Nancy Cavallero
excellent.
typing right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Nancy.
And folks online, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat. Oh, I see we have a couple people chiming in. Whoops. I wonder if I can make Nancy unmuted.
Soil respiration has gone up, and we do know that the carbon sink from forest has gone down. Yeah, but how does that scale up on a global average? I do not know. Perhaps. We have another question. Okay, Nancy's gonna put a finer point on her. Okay, that is globally. Okay, great. Thank you, Nancy.
Oh.
Thank you. Okay,
Thanks.
Next question was if I, or maybe we, had $1 million to invest in ocean obs and technology, where and what would you focus on? Ooh, that is a good question. I would have to say that, I guess my stock answer, I've been asked something around this for the last several days by several different askers, and because I work at the interface of science and decision making, I would say I would invest the money in helping develop the decision-making systems and processes to make sure that the data we have are being fully used in making good science-based decisions. Because I think that we have oodles of cool equipment, and I don't think you would find a scientist today who would be like, nope, that piece of equipment is not cool enough to put in the ocean. People love gear. But I think that we need to work with social scientists and folks expert in sort of decision-making psychology to understand exactly how we can best put that information that we're getting from all these data streams to use. And I think that we will see a real moving forward of being able to make these really well-informed decisions if we do that. But I'm biased.
And we have a few more questions coming, it looks like. And Christine followed up with, is any of this work underway?
I think to some extent, I think the conversation about how we put all of this new data from all these cool technologies into the hands of groups who can use it to help make decisions, I think that is lagging a little bit. There are some really encouraging outcomes from, for example, ocean planning, where vast amounts of data have been used in a multi-stakeholder process to make decisions that are sort of widely agreed upon by all. And I think we can learn from that and apply those lessons elsewhere. Have I ever worked with the NERS coastal training programs to assist with science to management concepts? I have not, but I would love to learn more about that.
I'll put you in touch with Marissa afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? And Christian, I'm sorry I called you Christine.
I have to say, this is a much gentler audience than I faced last Wednesday.
Oh yeah, you were at Congress testifying, right?
That was.
Oh.
Everybody's really nice here. This is nice. I like it.
Do you want to tell us about that a little bit, or would you rather not?
So last Wednesday, slightly before that, but not much before that, I was invited to testify for the House Science Committee's Environment Subcommittee, and they wanted to have a hearing on what we know about ocean climate change. And so the subcommittee wanted me to talk about sort of all the things as sort of the lead witness to kick off the more specialized input from the other witnesses. And they specifically asked me to talk about the findings of this report and the National Climate Assessment, and sort of broad brush, what do we know about how ocean climate change is manifesting in the ocean and how it can affect human communities. So that was kind of a big job, and I had 5 minutes to testify, and then I was ready to take questions, but I also submitted written testimony. And then my other fellow panelists were Bradley Horton from Lamont Doherty, who is an expert in sea level rise, Tom Fraser from University of Florida, who is a fisheries, he has the greatest background in fisheries, but he also had some commentary on coral reef restoration work. And then we also had Margaret Polaro, who is the director of the Pacific Coast Shellfish Growers Association. And what was really cool about that hearing was that the whole environment subcommittee was very much of the mind that, like, yep, climate change is here, what do we do about it? You know, they're really looking ahead to solutions, which I found really, really inspiring. So it was a great conversation that day too, but it was just a little bit more like terrifying because the questioners could take you far afield. I got questions on the Green New Deal and all kinds of stuff, so yeah.
Yeah, and I think what you also said about, you know, we just need to translate the scientific information into solutions or into management, whatever, however we do that. Like you said, the House doesn't know what to do. Like, how shall we move forward? So let's take that $1 million and figure out what to do there, huh?
And I think there are, you know, from my own work here at Ocean Conservancy, there are a lot of sort of communities and regional experts who really know their waterfront and they know their communities and what's important to their communities. And I think listening to the needs of communities is absolutely a great way to start. So that's, you know, I think, and it's hard, you know, when you're thinking about what should the federal government do, because that's naturally a top-down entity. But it's, you know, we have some cases where this kind of, you know, regional process works really well. So trying to figure out how to export those best practices from one place to another is another challenge. So I'd put some of that with the, if I had my magical $1 million to invest. That's what I would do.
Okay, are there any other questions? Going once, going twice. Johnny, do you have some words you want to say? I did want to note that next week in this series we have, on March 12th, we have Recent trends, drivers, and projections of carbon cycle in forests and wetland soils across North America with 4 speakers, Grant Domke, Chris Williams, Randy Kolka, and Carl Trenton. So join us next Tuesday at 12 for Seminar 3 in this series. And Yami, if you have any other things you want to say, please add them now.
I note that she's typing, so maybe her audio has cut out.
While we're waiting, Sarah, thank you so much for this terrific presentation. And folks, it will be available on the websites that Yami pointed out, and you can email either one of us if you can't find the PDF or the video. They'll both be available within a few days.
Yes.
So thank you,
and
Sarah.
I definitely recommend that you look up the chapter and just give it a skim if you're interested, because obviously it's far more articulate than I could be.
Can you go back to the slide where it shows the link to the chapter, your chapter 17? Or?
Well, it's the link to the whole report, but of course I think you should be reading chapter 17. But the whole report is interesting. It's just a lot of good time.
Okay, yeah. Great. And Yami just cycled up to where that was. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Any last words, Sarah?
No, thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, Yami.
Take care.
Bye-bye.